Hello and welcome to our latest video on the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill. Today we're here to talk about the implications of the bill for dark patterns. I'm Katrina Anderson, an Associate Director at Osborne Clarke.
And I'm Nick Johnson, a partner at Osborne Clarke.
So Nick, I know you've been particularly looking at the new definition of vulnerability under the DMCC.
I have. The DMCC changes the definition of vulnerable consumer and introduces the idea that a consumer can be vulnerable by virtue of the circumstances that they find themselves in. It's a concept of situational vulnerability. And it also introduces some changes around the concept of aggressive practices, which would mean that practices can be seen as aggressive and subject to the particular rules in the consumer protection regulations around aggressive practices if they are targeting the vulnerabilities of a vulnerable consumer. And those two changes taken together introduce some potentially interesting new risks for dark patterns and user interface design, in as much as they could potentially be giving rise to aggressive practices. So for instance, if you have a practice of repetitively targeting individuals at a time when you know that they are hungry and targeting them with ads for unhealthy foods, it could potentially be argued that that is an aggressive practice.
And one that exploits a certain situational vulnerability.
Correct.
As well.
Yeah.
They're very interesting. We've also seen some changes to the blacklisted offences, which are very relevant to dark patterns. So we've always had this idea of blacklisted offences in consumer protection law, but in restating that law, there's been some small changes made, which are very significant for dark patterns. So in particular, the government has re-looked at this idea of persistent and unwanted communication. That used to be limited to certain communication channels, which were a little retro these days, telephone and fax and such like. But it's now been made communication channel neutral. So it would cover things like pop-ups online. So all of a sudden, perhaps a dark pattern like nagging, where you're repeatedly asking perhaps for consent from a consumer when they don't want to give it, could be caught under that blacklisted offence, which does pose some challenges because sometimes you need to communicate to consumers for a good reason, but at the moment there's only a carve-out if you have a contractual obligation, which, for example, maybe you have a security breach, might not be covered. So it would be good if that carve-out was widened a little. Obviously the bill is still in draft, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that.
And there were some changes around urgency claims as well, weren't there, which is an area where we've been seeing a lot of regulatory interest recently.
Absolutely, yes. So again, the government has re-looked at that pressure selling offence, and they have made a very small change of taking the word very out. So it used to be pressure selling was when it's very limited in time, but now it's just limited in time, which obviously expands the concept of pressure selling and will make enforcement for certain techniques a little bit easier. And I think in the context of the scrutiny we've seen by the CMA on timers, on urgency claims, on scarcity claims, this does suggest that there could be more enforcement under that blacklisted offence. Obviously the bill is still in draft form and things can change, so it's definitely one to watch. If you want to see more materials on the DMCC, please do look at the Osborne Clarke website or reach out to your normal OC contact.